Hey Beatle fans, this is another video in my Let It Be Get Back series, and we're going to look at some of the strife that came to the surface in some of these sessions, and we're going to eavesdrop on some more Beatle meetings here on Pop Goes the 60s. There's been a lot of speculation as to what material Peter Jackson will be using for the new Get Back film or what he will not be using. And I have to believe that he's going to use the best quality material available, which may mean that he's going to leave some out, that the quality is just very poor. And I've got some of that here I'm going to play for you. And as always, I'm going to transcribe it so you can understand what Beatle is saying what. Now, we're going to start with some audio from day number 2 on January 3rd, 1969, where George arrives with some optimism.
You know, I mean, we've got to do that in order to get the good bit. Right. You know, we've got to go through that bit of shit at the meeting until we get together again.
You know, I can see it just we were just working.
And also, there's so much to get out, you know.
Yeah, right.
And there's nobody better to get it out with than us. For me, anyway, really. My heart of hearts.
Yeah.
It should be where, you know, if you write a song, I feel as though I wrote it. And verses. You know, I mean, or to be involved with it as much as it, you know. That was the good thing about the last album. It's the only album so far I tried to get involved with.
This optimism that he brought doesn't last that long as he starts to get a little bit passive-aggressive with Paul and John.
That's good enough for the rock and roll thing, but like I think then it,
You need Eric Clapton.
no, you don't. You need like a.
All right, so this exchange is a little bit uncomfortable where George is not able to play something, or Paul again is at the helm here. I think it's I've Got a Feeling. And Paul is trying to explain what he's looking for, and George says, well, you need an Eric Clapton. And John Lennon goes, no, we need a George Harrison. So Harrison, from Lennon's perspective, is maybe not giving his all, and Harrison is a little bit flustered, I suppose, because he's being asked something that maybe he doesn't want to do or can't do, or he just maybe doesn't feel free to play his own thing.
If you all can't get it together, that's really very sad. So I think what we should do now is let you play a little, and then you all have lunch together. So should we leave you for a while? I mean, everybody.
Yes, What I was saying about the songs was like the reason, you know, like I've got about 20 songs from 1948 was because I knew very well the moment I bring them in the studio that it's gone, you know, and so I never did, and like slowly now I can bring a couple out because I can get it more like how it should have been then, and that's, you know, that's why, you know, it's like it's just.
See, it doesn't matter what's going wrong. It really doesn't matter what's going wrong, as long as the four of us notice it.
Well, I noticed it all right.
No, but you know, instead of just noticing it, determined to put it right. You know, because that's what I'm on
So
to.
we should have a divorce.
Well, I said that at the last meeting. But it's getting nearer, you know. Who'd have the children? Dick James.
So George brings up something that obviously has been on his mind for a long time, and that is recording more of his songs. And the way he phrases it after he brings it up, he went something like, you know, recording them how they should have sounded originally. And, you know, he could have just come out and said, hey, John and Paul, how do you feel about recording more of my songs? That would have been more direct. But he doesn't quite do that, and that's not how these guys always communicate with one another. So the other thing that gets brought up here is the D word, divorce. And here this is the second time it's been brought up. Paul had brought it up in the prior meeting, George brings it up here, and then John brings it up like 8 months later in September when he effectively leaves the band. But here they make light of it all, and then they joke about Dick James getting the children. And there's a little more talking going on before they just do a count in and just start to play I've Got a Feeling. So one of the other things that almost never gets mentioned is George's marriage during this time. So Patty walked out on him on the 4th. And the argument between John and George when George left the band, that was on the 10th on a Friday, that's the day George went to collect Patty after her being gone for a few days. So this is never brought up with the guys. I don't know if they knew about it or not. They may not even have known about it. A lot of this comes from Patty Harrison's book. It's funny how if you read the page in his diary, how flippant he is about everything. And the walkout of Patty doesn't even get mentioned. Here's what his diary says. Got up, went to Twickenham, rehearsed until lunchtime, left the Beatles, went home, and in the evening did King of Pho at Trident Studios, had ships later at Klaus and Christine's, went home. So here you see George's flippancy about his marriage, sidestepping all responsibility and shifting blame to the Beatles in many cases. I mean, you hear this in any kind of retelling of the history during this time. He never mentions any problems at home. It's only problems with the Beatles. And poor Michael Lindsay Hogg, I mean, he had to put up with not only this, but the Johnny Yoko thing going on. He had to put up with a lot.
No other love have I.
If I needed
What's
Tripper.
from?
That's from
Babies
the
in
old
Black.
shows.
Oh, can we get a shot of this, Les?
Les. I want a shot of this, Les. Babies in Black.
Can you get in the
If I needed Tripper.
I mean, that's how flexible we can get.
I feel fine yesterday. I want to be nowhere man, paperback long tall.
Because I think at some point we should talk
You get it?
conceptually about the show.
Some of the feedback I've received with regard to some kind of whitewashing of this new cut by Peter Jackson. People suggest that, well, the Beatles knew the cameras were on, so they're acting accordingly. And there's probably some truth to that, although the cameras do pick up on things that they weren't aware of. Now, after John and George had this argument and George walked out, Michael Lindsay Hogg took it upon himself to hide some microphones and some cameras so that the Beatles didn't know they were always being filmed or recorded. Some of this is just audio. He even had some of the phones bugged. So in this upcoming piece of audio I want to play for you, I apologize because the quality isn't very good because this is the day after George left. John and Paul are having lunch in the commissary. And I'm not sure where Hogg placed the microphone. It sounds like it might be on the next table, but you hear tons of like clanking and plates hitting silverware and things like that. So, but here the guys are having a heart-to-heart about George.
Point that we both is that you try and make George play competently because you're afraid that how he'll play won't be like you want him to play. And that's what we do, and that's what you do to me.
Yeah.
And that's the difference when you were saying that you were so annoyed at me being arrogant on the Beatles album. Was that I got to a bit where I thought, it's no good me telling them how to do it. You know, all I tried to do on that album was just sing it to you like I was drunk, you know.
Yeah.
Just did my best to say, now look, it stands up on its own. If I'm not doing it quite well this time, like even Don't Let Me Down, the first time I sang it, because I hadn't allowed myself to say it was a whole song. I couldn't, it was only after we'd done it that I realised it was done. You know, and on the Beatles album, I just sort of said, look, here it is, you can all hear, this is me singing it drunk. I'll pretend it is if I'm not. What would you do with it? You know, George, you play whatever you like.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what it was. It wasn't the arrogance of, listen, this is it, baby. It was that, I can't tell you what to play, George, because you won't play what I think you should play.
Yeah, right.
And
See, that's
I'm not going to tell you what to
that
play.
seems to be the trouble. Is that okay? That's great, isn't it? And then if you've been able to say that on the occasion, just even say, look, I'm not going to say anything about the song because it's really difficult. I'm going to really try now to sing it to you.
Yeah, I know. Because you would say, listen, we haven't arranged it.
I know.
I'd say, listen,
I say that, of course, when you haven't said that to me, because I haven't picked it up off you.
But the point is,
sort of, I think,
I'm saying that Dear Prudence is arranged. Can't you hear boom, boom, boom?
yeah.
That is the arrangement, you know.
Yeah.
But I'm too frightened to say, this is it, but I'd just sit there and say, if you don't come along and play a bit, I won't do the song, you know, I can't do any better than that. But don't ask me for what boogie you're going to play on it. Because apart from not knowing, I can't tell you better than you what boogie to play on it. You know, I just can't work, I can't do it like that. I never could, you know. Now when you think back on the other album, just think, how much more have I done towards the number than that? I've never told you what to sing or what to play. You know, I've always done the numbers like that. Now, the only regret about the past numbers is when, because I've been so frightened, I've allowed you to take it somewhere where I didn't want. And then my only chance was to let George take over or interest George in it, because I knew she said well, he'd take it as is.
So this issue regarding George being gone and how both Paul and John have treated him over this time gets discussed here, and it ends up being a discussion more in just the dynamics of the band, and particularly Paul and his penchant to do the arranging. And it's interesting how certain songs get brought up. We heard in a prior video I did on the argument between Paul and George, where Paul had brought up the song trying to illustrate a point of, he brought up the session for Hey Jude, where he asked George not to play something. That struck a chord with George at that time, and that kind of escalated that argument. Well, here, John brings up an example, and Paul knows exactly what he's talking about. He goes, she said, she said. So these songs, I mean, these guys always seem to be able to get it together in the studio when things are working well and produce great music. But there's also strife that goes along with that creativity, and they seem to know exactly which song was a problem or there were issues. Another song that gets mentioned in this discussion that's very hard to hear is Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, and John kind of letting Paul to arrange that, and maybe John allowed him to arrange too much of that, and it ended up not being quite how John wanted, and that called to mind some backlash that fans had given Paul McCartney in recent years for playing that song live, and people kind of saying, well, you can't play a John song, that's a John song. Well, I think that song had more to do with Paul than we ever knew.
Because I mean, all of those things you say, you know, in some way apply to me, not always.
Yes,
because
everything
you
applies a
say,
little bit to each other.
they all, you know, in some way, in some degree,
Well, because there was a period where none of us could actually say anything about your arrangements.
Yeah.
Because you would reject it all.
Yes, sure.
And so George and I would just, you know, like you do that. Okay, you know, we'll do four in the bar, and I'll go. And a lot of the times you were right. You know, a lot of the times you were the same as they all were. But I can't see the answer to that.
No, but that's good. See, the thing is, like within each other, within ourselves, we reach something that's nearly perfect. For everyone else who's listening to it, that's it. We've got it. You know. I mean, it's only that we've never said that to George. I've never said to George, look, George, I think when I want a guitar bit, I want it exactly like I want it. And he's got to say to me then, you can't have it. You know, see, but that's it. Wiley never says that to me, and I never say that to him. We're going, and we get trouble. But really, I mean, it is going to be much better if we can actually just sit together and say, look, George, I've got a feeling, I want you to do it exactly like I play. And he'll say, I'm not you, and I can't do it exactly like you do.
Well, that's where the tape ends on my recording anyway. I don't know if there's more available, but that's all I've got. What's interesting is the Beatles seldom talk like this. I mean, and by the way, Ringo, Linda, and Yoko are present there. I don't know if they're all there throughout this whole thing, but they're all kind of having lunch together. And it's very unusual that you hear these guys talk like this for any extended amount of time. They're always being flippant and talking a little bit almost like in code, and they're not saying exactly what they mean. Well, that's not the case here. And it's kind of interesting to hear them really tackle an issue that's very important, because they got a guy that's left the band, at least temporarily. And the other thing I want to mention too is that for all the talk about John Lennon being whacked out on heroin and completely either dysfunctional or not willing to participate, we don't hear that in this meeting. Here, Paul is essentially, again, Paul takes a back seat to John when John assumes the leadership role, which he seems to be doing here. So, will any of this stuff be used in the Peter Jackson film? I don't know. Maybe there's some better software that can improve this audio quality, I hope. But some of this, I'm sure, if there's video to it, I'm sure we'll maybe hear some of it or see some of it. So, this whole video here basically illustrates some of the hardships they were dealing with, but they had a lot of fun as well, like this little thing that they do right here.
Is that one called I've Got a Feeling?
Well, I got hard on.
Everybody had a hard on.
Everybody had
Except
a hard
for me and
on.
my monkey. Everybody been building that one from the beginning.